So once we have GDP calculated, we now can compare how an economy is doing at one point in time versus another. But we've got a serious problem. If we're trying to compare how well an economy is doing across somewhat distant time periods, we have to worry that the dollar bill, the common denominator of GDP calculations, might not be worth the same as it used to be. So when your grandpa says he used to buy a bottle of Coke for a dime, we have to realize that the unit of measure, a dollar, wasn't worth exactly the same thing. So we have to worry about what's called inflation. And thus we have to speak of real GDP versus nominal GDP. In economics, a real value of a good or other entity has been adjusted for inflation. It's been adjusted for the fact that a dollar bill is not worth the same thing today as it is on into the future. In contrast with the real value, a nominal value has not been adjusted for inflation. The nominal value is the sticker price. It's what's on the price tag. It's what you actually paid for it when you buy the thing. It's not adjusted in any way. It's just whatever the sticker price was when you purchased something, that's the nominal price. The term real means that it has been adjusted for inflation. Price indexes are the way that we adjust for inflation. Price indexes are used to adjust income and output data for the effects of inflation. It's simply a measure of the cost of purchasing a market basket or a market bundle of goods at some point in time relative to the cost of purchasing that same market basket during an earlier reference or base period of time. One price index that is very common is the consumer price index. This is a key price index that we want to think about, the CPI. The consumer price index measures the impact of price changes on the cost of a typical bundle of goods and services purchased by households or consumers, right? So it's taking a bundle of goods that consumers typically buy, making that a bundle of goods, a kind of a market basket of goods that a typical consumer buys, and then comparing how much did that bundle of goods cost at one time period, and then how much does it cost at another time period. Right, and so that's the consumer price index, CPI. It's measuring kind of a typical bundle of goods that consumers purchase. Another key price index is the GDP deflator. This is designed to measure the change in the average price of the market basket of goods that's included in GDP. The GDP deflator includes only domestic goods and not anything that is imported. So we're measuring the price index of our production, of our gross domestic product, what we've produced within our borders. The CPI, the consumer price index, includes anything bought by consumers within our domestic country, whereas the GDP deflator is looking at the things that we have produced. The GDP deflator is a broader price index than the CPI. The CPI is looking at the typical household's bundle of goods that they consume. So mostly just focusing here on C of our GDP. Whereas the GDP deflator is looking at C, I, and G, consumption, investment, and government expenditure. Now the CPI and the GDP deflator yield very similar estimates to the rate of inflation, but every now and then, for whatever task we have as economists, we're going to be kind of swayed towards using the GDP deflator or the CPI. But by and large, they yield very similar rates of inflation calculations. So how do you find the CPI, right? The first thing that you need to do is you need a reference point. And so what you're going to do is you're going to equalize some year out to 100 for our base year. So you're going to equalize the year you want out as the reference point to 100. So however much the CPI or the typical bundle of goods cost you during this year, if you're going to make this your base year, what you do is you have to equalize this out to 100. So how do we go about doing that? So for example, you buy 2 coats for $50 each and 3 shirts for $10 each in the year 2010. 2010 is going to be our base year that we're going to use here. And so what we need to do is we need to take this as our typical bundle of goods. We're going to say that 2 coats and 3 shirts. That's our bundle of goods that we want to compare. And we want to say, okay, well, how much does this cost? Well, 2 times 50 plus 3 times 10 is going to give us 130. And so we need to equalize this out to 100. So our bundle of goods cost 130. But in order to create it as our base year, we always go normalize it down to 100. And so we need to take this 130 and put this into our formula for calculating CPI. So our formula is going to be our total current year divided by the base year total times 100. So what we do here is our total current year is 130. That should be divided by the base year's total, which this year is our base year, so it's 130. And then we multiply this by 100. So we have 130 divided by 130, which gives us 1 times 100. And so our CPI ends up being 100 for the base year. And so now what we want to do is we want to contrast this to some other year's spending. And so let's look at 2014's consumption. So for a different year's CPI, you take that same bundle of goods, multiplied by their prices to get the current year's total, right? So we want to say in 2014, what did we purchase? In 2014, we purchased 3 coats for $60 each, 3 shirts for $10 each, and a hoodie for $30. And so our approach to CPI, we're very tempted to then say, okay, 3 times 60 gives you 180, plus 3 times 10, that's now up to 210. And now add to that $30 more for that hoodie. We're tempted to say 240 here. But this is not our bundle of goods. Our original bundle of goods was 2 coats and 3 shirts. And so what we need to do is take that bundle, 2 coats and 3 shirts, and multiply it by the 2014 year prices. And so if we do that to calculate our 2014 CPI, what we can do is we can say, okay, well, what is our current year's total for that original bundle of goods? The original bundle of goods is that 2 coats and the 3 shirts. Well, the coats are $60 each this year in 2014, and the 3 shirts, they're $10 each in 2014. And so in 2014, that bundle of goods cost us $150. Now we can take that CPI equation and we can plug everything in. Our total in this current year is 150. Our base year's total is still that 130, and then we multiply it by 100, and our CPI in the year 2014 then is 115.38. This is telling us how expensive that same bundle of goods is in 2014 in comparison to 2010. In 2010, the CPI was just 100, and in 2014, it's 115.38. With all of this information, we can now compare GDPs across time and have them adjusted into real terms. If we have a price index, either the GDP deflator or the CPI, we can use this formula here to convert any kind of nominal GDP into a real GDP in a different time period. And so what we have to do to figure out time period 2's real GDP, we can take its nominal GDP multiplied by the price index from the previous or other time period divided by the price index of this time period, right? So data on both money GDP and price changes are essential for meaningful comparisons of output between 2 time periods. And this equation allows us to do these things. In essence, we're getting the real price of past value equal to the nominal price, the unadjusted, the sticker price of some past value, multiplied by the price index of now divided by the price index from the past. You really just kind of have to mess with this formula and do some example problems to really kind of get at understanding what's happening here. And so let's go through and kind of do an example. So here's the question. My grandma made $10 a day in 1950, and the CPI was 20. Currently, the CPI is 100. What is the real value of my grandma's earnings in terms of today's dollars? What this question is essentially asking us is, hey, my grandma way back in the day made $20. Was that a lot of money? Was that a little money? How do we compare it to making money now, right? Is $20 in 1950 the same thing as making $20 now? What is the real value adjusted for inflation, right? What is the real value of my grandma's earnings from 1950? So when my grandma was making $10 a day in 1950, how much was that really worth? That's what we're trying to get at here with these figures. What is the real value of my grandma's earnings in terms of today's dollars? Now we need certain things to be able to figure this out. We need to know the nominal amount she had. We need to know the price index that existed in 1950. And we need to know the price index of today to be able to make this comparison. Did my grandma actually make a lot of money when she was making $10 a day? Or was that actually really a small amount of money to make, as it seems like it would be to us now? $10 a day in nominal terms right now in the current present day, man, that doesn't seem like very much money. But maybe in 1950 it was. How do we adjust for the dollar being worth a different amount then than it is now? That's what we have to do with this equation, and we have enough information here to use that past formula to answer this question. So we would take that formula, the real price of the past value is equal to the nominal price of the past value times the price index of now divided by the price index of the past. If we know that my grandma made this $10 a day in 1950 when the CPI was 20 and currently the CPI is 100, what is the real value of my grandma's earnings in terms of today's dollars? Well, let's just start plugging in the variables that we know. So in nominal terms, my grandma made $10 a day. So we can plug in 10 for the nominal value that we had in the past, right? So we can have that 10 plugged in there. Now what we need to do is we need to plug in some of the other variables. So we also know what the CPI was in the past in 1950. The CPI was 20, so we plug that into our equation. So now we have the nominal value in the past and we have the past CPI index of 20. Now we need to figure out the CPI of now in order to be able to solve for the real past value. That information is given to us. It's given to us as 100. So the current CPI is 100. And so now we just have one variable remaining. We don't know what that is until we do the math from this equation. But when we do the math, we can see that the real value that my grandma made in a day was $50 a day. So it doesn't seem quite as bad as just making $10 a day now that it is adjusted for inflation. All right, so this has been measuring GDP through time. What we talked about here is the idea of price indexes and how to calculate different price indexes, and then how to take those calculations of the price indexes and compare them across time, compare them to price indexes at other dates. For more on GDP, click the video link here to continue on in this lecture series.